are aware of already, Major John Newman. John Newman is going to be speaking today about, I think, at least on his recent discoveries in the National Archives pertaining to the documents released this summer from the CIA, his opinion of them and how they relate to Lee Harvey Oswald. Let's have a hand for John Newman.
I'm very pleased to be here to talk about this. As I tell some friends of mine, this is really a loss of virginity for me. Inasmuch as I venture outside of the safety box that I've been in for the last couple of years, I was tempted by Frontline, really, to get into this area. I did box myself off from the rest of the project, much the way I did when I worked with Oliver Stone on JFK. I did not know what Oliver was doing really in other areas. And I did that because I didn't want to be influenced in any way. As it turns out, there was a really neat thing that happened, which is that the name I turned up in the files had already been mentioned by Don Densley, the fellow who appeared in Shadows on the Frontline piece, if you've seen it. And I'll mention this again if this seems a bit cryptic to you. In any event, let me begin by asking, what was the nature of Lee Harvey Oswald's interest in Russia? Does it change, or did it change at any time? Do we know when, if it did? And what was the nature and extent of the agencies, that would be the CIA's interest in Lee Harvey Oswald? Did it ever change? Do we know anything about that? How has the public and Congress been informed about these matters? Have we been told the truth? Are we getting access to the truth now? And most of all, what's in these files? Is this working? I made reference a little bit earlier this morning to something I had put in the record over a year and a half ago in an oversight hearing not dissimilar to the one conducted on Wednesday. It's an internal CIA memorandum dated 27 April 1979. It's a little bit redacted, so we don't really know who made this memo. But it's all about G. Robert Blakey and his HSCA staff members, and it talks about categories of material to be sequestered, and that word sequestered comes up when you go over to the archives, because there are really two sorts of CIA files over there. One is what they call the 201 file on Oswald, and then the rest of it's called the sequestered files, and that's where this word comes from. And that would really mean all the information that was either provided to or generated and classified and categorized as a result of the House Select Committee investigation. And I just wanted to point out to you a couple of sentences in this memorandum. One is referring to the 201 file in the CIA on Lee Harvey Oswald, and the sentence in here says that this material, the 201 file on Lee Harvey Oswald, which fills up 2 4-drawer safes. And I want to make a distinction about this, because if I were the CIA director, you were, and you said, hey, Jim, bring me the 201 file on Oswald, they wouldn't roll it down the hallway on a dolly with 2 safes on it. There would be a small manila folder that would be plopped on your desk, maybe 5, 6, or 7 pages, la creme de la creme, that would have been skimmed from all those drawers, and drawers full of material would be in this little manila folder. So that's a 201 file in one sense, but this, as researchers, we come to know Lee Harvey Oswald's 201 file is these safes and safes full of stuff. Anyway, the sentence goes on. Oswald's 201 file was not completely reviewed by HSCA staff members. And then one other sentence, files not reviewed by HSCA staff members fill almost 4 4-drawer safes. And an inventory of that was made by the CIA. So that's quite a lot of material. And I've often seen Blakey say or claim that he's seen everything. And of course, Gerald Posner's claim that he hasn't had a chance to go through them, but that doesn't matter because he's talked to Blakey. And Blakey has seen everything, doesn't really do very much for me either. So we haven't seen everything until the passage of this law, and happily, one of the areas where the release has been most significant is the CIA. In fact, as I've been doing my work in these files, Director Woolsey at a couple of points has changed his mind. About a month ago, he announced when testifying before Congress that documents that he had decided only 30 days prior to that announcement to keep secret would in fact be released. And as we speak today, in fact yesterday, or the day before, whenever it was, now I can't remember, from all the airline strikes and it was Wednesday, that's right. The last 1,700 pages of the Oswald's 201 file were in fact showing up in the archives. So we are now told that it is all there minus 20 pages. And that would not include things that are redacted or have pieces missing. There are 35 rolls of microfilm that have some 120,000 pages of material that has not been released. And there are some other materials that the agency has that are, they call third agency materials. This would be materials, for example, Peter, probably Army files, Navy files, Air Force files that they're waiting for the other agencies to get clearance for. So we have not seen any of that material released at all. What I'm going to talk about right now is based upon what the CIA has released, and it is primarily its own records and amazingly quite a bit of FBI material and Secret Service material. And what's interesting about this material are the cover sheets. Peter, can I have that? I'm going to show you a couple of slides, cover sheets, but these are better. This is a cover sheet, and although you can't see what's on it in any detail from where you are, all this writing down this column here is actually offices inside the CIA that handled this particular file that was attached to this. And these are the initials of the people in each office who signed for it. And then when you read the files, you often see little marginalia, little handwriting. And this is wonderful. The House Select Committee saw none of these cover sheets. And for the first time, we have the routing slips and the marginalia, to me, which are the roadmap into the minds of the people who handled Lee Harvey Oswald's files inside the CIA, and they're terrifically enlightening. Before I do that, I just thought I would show you very briefly just a couple of slides from these files to give you a feel or a sense for what they are. If we could just turn the lights down, and I'll show you just a couple. Oh, that was reversed. This must be. That's actually the cover. These boxes have the actual old cardboard 201 file folders in them. That's what it looks like. This is a document that's very interesting, and if I have time, I'll return to it later. I called it the Mostam document, the Mostam being the name of the boat that Lee Harvey Oswald and his family traveled back to the United States on. It turns out it's a lot more than that. This is a cover sheet. It's from an agency field office of some sort, which is blacked out here. It has three attachments, A, B, and C. And A is about the Mostam itself. B and C, the descriptions of the attachments are totally redacted. This is A, again about the Mostam. There's a neat little indicator up here, ZR, with a slash mark through it. And these files are full of these little indicators. And the ZR is in red ballpoint pen, and the slash mark would be in bright orange or yellow crayon through it. So it lights up like a Christmas tree. And then here's Lee Harvey Oswald's 201 file number as well. And I'll get back to that later, what all these things mean. Of course, the ZR was interesting for those of you who know about ZR rifle and so on, but this is not associated with ZR rifle, and it took me almost 2 to 3 months to crack what these indicators really mean. Here is attachment B, and I was a little disappointed in the CIA's new openness when I saw this. And this is attachment C, and some more of attachment C. Yeah, these are these are the new release, but I actually do have some very intriguing information that I found only 2 days ago on Wednesday before I testified about this document, and I'll return to it later. This is an example of what the Mexico City photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald, which of course were not Lee Harvey Oswald, looked like prior to the release of these files, and now you have much better photographs. They are not cropped anymore. They're wonderful. This here is an example again of an indicator. It's a little bit too small for you to see probably. Instead of a ZR, there's an FR, and that's Castro here. Castro is filed in here as an FR. I'll explain that later. Again, the slash marks through them. This is a cover sheet. I was holding one up a minute ago. Here would be offices listed. In fact, I should have a better one here. Oh, here is a file with the, again, designators. Here is a third one. This is an H. This is an H over Lee Harvey Oswald and over Bringay. And in fact, we think these were placed here prior to 22 November 1963, and there's some significance to that. And again, I'll return to that later. This is one of the very first FBI documents that ended up in Lee Harvey Oswald's file. It predates the existence of a 201 file, and the designator, again, was an H. Well, in fact, while it's up here, I might as well go ahead and explain this instead of being cryptic about it anymore. These designators, these ZRs, these H's, these FRs, are part of an internal classification system whereby, as I said, you have safes and safes boatloads full of documents on individuals in some cases, certainly so on Lee Harvey Oswald. What this is doing here, this is telling somebody, a clerk, a records entrance person of some sort, to abstract certain information, in this case what's underlined in the red ballpoint pen again. That's why I had this photograph made so you can see the color here, because you can go to the archives and see these originals. What's underlined here is to be abstracted and put into a computer database of some sort. The ZR, as it turns out, would signify that the information here, sometimes instead of being underlined, it has a greater than sign before right here and one right at the end, would be the same thing as underlining it, to take that information and put it under a 201 file number, and the ZR is the most restrictive classifier. If there was a ZR on this, it would require that information to be put into only the 201 held at headquarters and not in any other place. The H allows for a broader holding of that information, including field offices, so that the ZR indicator would be the most restrictive and would probably be that little manila folder that would be plopped on the director's desk if he asked for the headquarters 201 on somebody. And in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, I'll tell you that James Angleton got control of the agency's investigation right after the assassination, and therefore what information was passed over to the Warren Commission on Lee Harvey Oswald. I went through all those files and myself went through and took out, recreated, reconstructed in my own computer everything that had been marked with the ZR indicator so that I could see what it looked like. And it reads like a roadmap to the KGB and Cuba. In other words, if one were to read just the information that was abstracted and indexed under the ZR indicator, one would have reason to believe or could be very worried that Lee Harvey Oswald might have shot John Kennedy in the employ of the Soviet Union. Whether or not Angleton really believed that is another question. We can debate that. We know he was a very paranoid man, but to read that ZR file would give one a reason to suspect that Oswald, that may have been working for the Russians. Also, that Angleton would have been doing this is significant because he was very concerned about a mole, and I'll return to that later. Here's more. There's Marina Oswald's 201 number. Are you here, Marina? I believe I've shown Marina her 201 number yet. And she was a ZR. She had a ZR file. This is another cover sheet. This here would be liaison office. This over here is the SAS, Special Affairs staff. All your dirty tricks guys are under there. The William Harvey staff would be under here. And this is, in fact, a file on Oswald. SAS Counterintelligence, and here's the fellow's name, Horn, who signed for this file. 15 November 1963. Here's another one. Let me see, I think I have one more here. Here is making sure that the abstractor does not, this would be a thick report, probably an FBI report of several hundred pages, and the person who has put together this cover sheet is saying, look, don't forget to go to page whatever this is, I can't read it from here, probably page 490 or whatever, and pick up the ZARD information there. And also an H reference here. So that's what that is, and that's what a cover sheet looks like. Can we have the lights back on, please? Now, I'm going to take you into this sort of the way I went into it rather than chronologically, because I think it might be helpful, and also because this first piece is actually what made it into the Frontline documentary. Not everything did. Obviously, the work I did for Frontline was late in the game. Didn't begin till this summer. They had already done a lot of their work and were pretty sure where they're going. I hadn't been in these files more than a week when one day I got a piece of paper, and in fact it was from a unit called the CI-SIG. Stands for Counterintelligence Special Investigations Group, and that was under James Angleton, and Peter will talk about that more shortly. And Birch D. O'Neill, his signature block was at the bottom. He was the chief of the CI-SIG, and in the upper right-hand corner was some writing, some handwriting, and I couldn't read it until I turned it over and looked at it in the light. It had been burned into the back of this, probably by a Xerox machine. It had come through, it had bled through, so that when you turn it around, you could read it, and it clearly says Andy Anderson 00 on Oswald. And 00 would be the office symbol for the Domestic Contacts Division. And what this marginalia means is that Andy Anderson was the DCD contact for Lee Harvey Oswald. What I did not know at that time is that Don Denslia, the man who had told the House Select Committee in 1978 that he had read a debrief, he did not mention Oswald's name at the time, but he said it was a Marine defector living in Minsk, working in a radio factory who had a family. And the odds of that being anybody than Lee Harvey Oswald would be astronomical. The debrief he read had a lot of, it was routine, had a lot of information about the radio plant that Oswald worked in Minsk. What I did not know is that Don Denslia had already told Frontline last March that the name that had signed off on this debrief report was one Anderson. So it was significant to have had an eyewitness to the debrief and then to have a document turn up with the same name on it. Now, Don Denslia was not believed by the House Select Committee because the agency has always denied having done a debrief. He was discredited after that. He's been very reticent to discuss it with anyone ever since, and I'll never forget the look on his face the night I showed him the document. I didn't know anything about Anderson at that point, and he looked and saw this Andy Anderson 00 on Oswald. His whole complexion changed. He felt vindicated, and probably because of that got the courage up to go on the front line in shadows and tell his story. Now, there's nothing conspiratorial about the fact that the agency debriefed Oswald when he came back. In fact, I was looking at a document over here Mark has about another Marine they debriefed, and he just went in, and that was actually in the spring of '61. They debriefed him in Scandinavia. We have the record or the recording that it documented that it did happen. he was just seeing relatives. They should have debriefed Oswald. It was their job. It was routine. What's significant is that the agencies lied about it. Now, the agency, their explanation was, we did not debrief this man because we weren't interested in him. That's a lie. The documents that I've seen, some of the ones I've shown you, demonstrate a hell of an interest in Oswald. In fact, there's a memo, we call it the TBC memo, because the initials at the bottom are TBC, the person who wrote it. He was chief of a branch called SR-6. SR-6, Soviet Russia, 6th branch, is under the Soviet Russia division inside the Directorate of Plans. This particular memo states categorically that the CIA had what they called an operational interest in Lee Harvey Oswald. It's in plain English. Besides that memo, you can look at the people who are on these cover sheets and establish a terrific level of interest in Oswald. I guess I'll get back to that in a minute because I want to share who they are with you. But the agency did not concoct this lie of we are not interested or we were not interested in Lee Harvey Oswald to cover up a routine debrief. That was not the problem. The reason that the agency claimed it was not interested in Oswald was to cover up something far more troubling, as it turns out. And the answer, and what that is really been staring us in the face all along. And that is when Lee Harvey Oswald, who worked at a CIA secret base in Atsugi, Japan, left the Marines, went to Moscow, announced his defection, along with his intent to commit espionage, the CIA failed to launch a counterintelligence investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald. Now that is totally unsatisfactory. There's no wiggle room on this. If it had only been that Oswald had defected, perhaps, even then it doesn't make sense, because when they do open this counterintelligence file on Oswald at the end of 1960, they do it simply on the basis of the defection, not on the basis of his intent to commit espionage. That's left out of the little report that goes back and forth between State Department and CIA. Now, no one today that you will talk to in the CIA will try and maintain this fiction anymore of not being interested in Oswald. And that's the reason they didn't do their job. The House Select Committee, you will be interested in knowing, was very disturbed about this question and probed the CIA vigorously, put several people under oath, but unsuccessfully in getting an answer as to why the agency had failed to open a 201 file on Oswald for 14 months. For 14 months, the CIA apparently is asleep at the switch. That's their job. So this is the problem analytically. What the hell's going on? Today I was asked, not today, but today in the context of the last several weeks as I began to speak with agency officials about this problem, as well as several former employees. I was asked if I'd ever considered the Murphy factor. You know, just the general things do screw up from time to time. And my answer is, yeah, sure, and I could accept that. Let me explain how that would work. We have a record, we know from House Select Committee files that our embassy in Moscow reported his intent, that not only that he was defecting, but that he intended to give up all of his secrets through channels back to Washington, and the Navy liaison officer over there reported the same thing through ONI channels. And we know that both of those messages went to the CIA within 24 hours. Okay, there's a record of that, those messages actually showing up. So it would have to go something like this, and this is totally made up, but they arrived in the Office of Security, we know that much, and then somebody was getting a cup of coffee and they put the pieces of paper on a table and somebody accidentally bumped them into the trash can. And therefore, there was no investigation launched. Or what misfiled. Somebody put them in the wrong folder and put that folder in the wrong drawer. Who knows? I can accept Murphy's Law on occasion. The problem I'm having is that I keep bumping into Mr. Murphy every time I go around the corner. For example, the FBI did not fail to launch a counterintelligence investigation of Oswald. It did in the spring of 1960, after contact with Oswald had been lost by the embassy. They lose contact with him. The last cable is dated around 8 March 1960. And the the FBI starts door-stopping Marguerite, Oswald's mother, and his brother, and they write up all the information and they send it over to the CIA. And we have these materials, and the FBI investigation goes straight over to the Soviet Russia division, because we have the cover sheet. And the first place it goes, the first stop it makes, is Soviet Russia Counterespionage Branch, properly so. This does not cause the agency to launch an investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald, still. So Mr. Murphy is alive and healthy again. And this is the problem, you see, that you have. There are other files we ran across. They're called soft files, meaning that they weren't true 201 files. They were just files kept in people's drawers. There was an HT Lingual file on Oswald at this point. And this is the mail intercept program. They were opening mail, and there was a number of pieces of paper that had been collected on Oswald in this file. There was an MS file, an Office of Security file. There were lots of files on Lee Harvey Oswald. Not the one, however, that should have been, and that would have been a 201 file. That would have marked him as not benign. That would have marked him as somebody that needed to be investigated because he was an intelligence or an espionage or an intelligence threat. Now, who was watching Lee Harvey Oswald in the CIA? From the very beginning, it's an interesting set of characters who handle his files and watch them. In fact, during the entire time that he's in the Soviet Union and after his return up to the time of his death, there were really 3 areas in the DDP. When I say the DDP, that's the Directorate of Plans, the sort of dark side of the house as opposed to the straight intelligence analysis side of the house. And that is, those 2 broad functional areas still describe the CIA today. Directorate of Operations is the name today, used to be Directorate of Plans then. There are really 3 areas that watch Oswald and handle his files. The first is the Soviet Russia division, and that would make sense. And the second is the CI-SIG, Angleton's mole hunting unit. There are some records-keeping types that show up on those routing sheets, but for the most part, it's the Soviet Russia division and CI-SIG until 1963. In September of 1963, we have a brand new group of people who begin to watch Oswald, and you saw a cover sheet with the SAS on it. The Special Affairs staff shows up in September of 1963 and will be all over his files up until the time of the Kennedy assassination. Within the SR division, it's very interesting which branches within SR are watching Oswald. And there are really 3 branches that show up all over these routing sheets. And the first is SR6. And in fact, I should hasten to add that the memorandum that I mentioned before that actually says we have an operational interest in Lee Harvey Oswald was written by the chief of SR6. It was written 3 days after the assassination as a memo for record. After Kennedy was dead and Lee Harvey Oswald was dead, the chief of SR6 sat down to document for internal purposes that he had requested the laying on of interviews with Lee Harvey Oswald in the summer of 1962 because they had an operational interest in it. SR6 had the job, among other things, they had several little things they did. The most interesting I find is the Soviet Realities program. Soviet Realities means legend painters. What they did was to collect information and even pieces of physical evidence. Could be matchbooks, pieces of paper, letters, postcards, anything that was authentic Russian, to paint a legend for a sleeper agent that would be posted inside the Soviet Union. So anyone who would come back from the Soviet Union would be potentially useful to SR6 because they could build up information to put together to make a story or a legend for a person. This was SR6. SR6 is the element in the CIA that shows up most often on Oswald's files. And there were two more branches in the Soviet Russia division that were extremely interested in Lee Harvey Oswald. And the first is SR9. SR9 was the branch which ran agents inside Russia from Moscow. Dead drops and this sort of thing. When I talk with some of the former employees of the Soviet Russia division, they indicated to me they thought it unlikely that Oswald would have been run in this manner because he was not high enough level. That this sort of thing would have been reserved for a very big catch, a Politburo member, maybe a senior Army officer, but certainly not Lee Harvey Oswald. Nonetheless, SR9 shows up as people handling his files. The third is SR10. SR10 was what they called legal travelers. And this would have been running agents inside the Soviet Union from Washington or from outside of the Soviet Union. So they would have no direct contact, as in the dead drop sort of thing. They would have to use the mails to communicate with their agents. And the two principal means of doing that at the time were secret writing and microdots. Of course, this would be interesting to those of you who are interested in the sort of microdot written in one of Oswald's, not his diary, I guess in one of his notebooks. So if, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald had a function, was an agent of some sort, and was not being run from SR9, he would have been run from SR10 through the mails using microdots or secret writing. Notice I say if. So those are the three areas in Soviet Russia division. Those responsible for developing legends for sleeper agents, and those running agents from Moscow and running agents from Washington inside the Soviet Union. Mole hunters, and of course that's interesting because a mole would be someone who was working either with our organization, maybe an employee or even a contract person, but would have contact with the agency, and therefore the threat of being penetrating the agency. So mole hunters, agent handlers, legend painters, these are very interesting sort of people to be watching the files of Lee Harvey Oswald. As I like to say, this doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove definitively that Oswald had an intelligence function, but these are the right kind of, right sort of branches. They're not watching economic information in South Africa. In fact, the other thing I should mention here is a negative factor. There wasn't anything I found so far in these files, and I hadn't seen the 1,700 pages that just went over there last week. But up to that time, I hadn't seen anything that indicated that Lee Harvey Oswald was a regular type of agent, that there was knowledge about him having carried out normal agent responsibilities. So if, in fact, he had some sort of function, it would have to be, I would think, would have to be some very close hold operation, as in a vest pocket operation, or some individual or a couple of individuals were behind, if in fact that were so. And that would be consistent, more consistent, I think, with what we see in these files today, if there was any association at all. And in fact, A vest pocket operation would be illegal. It would not be normal. It would be somebody doing something wrong. It would have to be somebody high level in order to be able to mask what they were doing and to be able to stop, for example, a 201 investigation being launched. This would move, if that were true, it would move one to ask the question about communications. How would you communicate with Lee Harvey Oswald? There are a number of things, possibilities, and actually there are some proprietary matters here. There's ongoing research, so I will just say this. There is hard evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was receiving information from outside of the Soviet Union while he was, quote, lost, unquote, during the period of time where no one outside of Russia knew where he was. He falls off the chart in March of 1960. We do not know where he is officially until February 1961. But there is hard evidence, both on film and interviews, physical evidence that he was receiving packages from someone outside of the Soviet Union. And I'll leave that where it is. Also, there's an intriguing thing, and I'd like to hear perhaps from Oleg Nechepurenko later on this. This trail did not pan out, but we became aware at some point that the Jewish underground was very active in Minsk, and that the agency had a special relationship with the Tel Aviv station, and that perhaps it may have been possible, one possible way of to get to him might have been through the Jewish underground, say perhaps Ziegler or somebody else. And I wondered, maybe you could tell us if you found out or know anything about this. But even though we looked into this, we could find nothing. I don't have time to talk about the Mozdam piece, so let me just, I talked about Angleton and the ZR business. Okay, let me just wrap it up by noting something. I've been an advocate for some time, for those who would look into these matters, that you need to pull together sort of overlays from different agencies, from different players, if you want to bring together in an aggregate manner something that would reflect a conspiracy, for example, and whatever conspiracy theory you have. For example, if politics were involved or policy were involved, you would have to show that planning for the movements and management of Lee Harvey Oswald somehow intersected with planning for whatever political motive was involved here. And I want to give you an example of how this might work, in certainly not in as a dramatic way as a political assassination, but it occurred to me to ask the following question about the structure of Oswald's stay in the Soviet Union. And indeed there is a structure. I've already mentioned the business about him being lost. We don't know where he is. That's very important to understand that if one were to talk about communication. But there's also this structure. Oswald goes over there for a reason, and he changes his mind to come back home. I mean, that's a structural aspect of his stay. When does he change his mind? In fact, I think you'll find that it's about the time that he decides to come back to the United States that he decides to get married. Very important point. It's roughly in late November or early December 1960. We don't find out about it, the embassy doesn't, until February, because the KGB intercepted his first letter and never gave it to the embassy. And he has to write again, and they don't get notice that he wants to come back until February. But in fact, this thought is in his mind as early as December, if not late November, I would argue. And that's from his perspective. From the agency's perspective, there's also a structure. And that's the most fundamental one, the one I've been driving at for the last hour. And that is whether he is looked upon as a benign individual or as a threat. And in fact, the sea change occurs in November of 1960. That's when they finally open a 201 file on him. Now, I could go on. There are other coincidences. And maybe if you're interested, I can mention one or two in the Q&A. But if you lay that information out in an overlay, you will see that there is a sea change in Oswald and what he wants to do And that same change occurs in the agency's view of him in November of 1960. And if one were interested in politics and linking politics up to Lee Harvey Oswald, there is a major political event which does occur in November 1960, and that would be the election of John Kennedy. And I just say that as not to be provocative in any sense, but simply as an example of where you can go analytically when you begin to pay attention to the structure of things. And I've used up more time than I should. I thank you very much.
John Newman. Thank you, John. I'd like to thank our next speaker for yielding 10 minutes of his time to Professor Newman to get into that arcane cryptology that's so dense and takes a little extra time to get into. Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker will be Peter Dale Scott, the author of, among other things, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. Peter Dale Scott.
I can't begin without saying how heartening it is to see all of you here. I was at the 10th anniversary symposium in Washington when Norman Mailer also spoke. Things have developed a great deal since then. There's almost the risk that they've developed so far that we're beginning to bureaucratize, and we have a panel here on Oswald as a defector, and then tonight Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City. I think one of my jobs is to try to contextualize the, I believe, extremely important information that John Newman has just given us, and to link it to what I think is the continuous story of Lee Harvey Oswald in the files. The other thing I have to say is that just as Colonel Nechepurenko never imagined that he'd be here in Dallas with a former FBI agent, I can tell you I never imagined that I would voluntarily yield some of my time to an active major in Army intelligence. But it's a sign that perhaps some very important convergence is happening here as we move into a new millennium where maybe, possibly, our government will be based more on full disclosure of the truth. I think that I think you people are very smart to be at this panel. There was a time once when I thought that maybe the story of Lee Harvey Oswald going to the Soviet Union was a fascinating story, but not a story that had any necessary links to the assassination in November of 1963. On the basis of the declassified documents, which I've only just begun to look at, I haven't studied them as long as John Newman by any means, I'm beginning to get a quite different idea that everything in the files about Lee Harvey Oswald is of relevance or potential relevance to the assassination, and it may be through this documentation that we get to the center of the story, because I believe that what is going on here, there are some very big secrets buried in those files, behind those documents, that what we're mostly learning through the documents that are released are the areas that we don't know about, but I think they are important. I suggested last week in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that we should learn to distinguish between Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who defected to the Soviet Union, and Lee Harvey Oswald, the file subject. One example is that Lee Harvey Oswald, the man, was disgruntled, felt like a loner, nobody paid any attention to him, but I can assure you that Lee Harvey Oswald, the file subject, got a great deal of attention in 1960, and in 1961, and in 1962, and in 1963, even before the JM Wave Station and Special Affairs staff got into the picture, and even before a report turned up in the Lee Harvey Oswald file that a Lee Harvey Oswald, who may not have been our Lee Harvey Oswald, the man, had met with a Colonel Kostikov in Mexico City, who was identified by the same people as handled the file as being a KGB agent who specialized in wet affairs, sabotage, and above all, most relevantly, assassinations. Because the existence of that little secret in Oswald's file, that he had met with an alleged KGB assassination expert just 5 or 6 weeks before the assassination, had a very big impact on how the assassination was investigated and above all how it was covered up. Let's focus on the fact that the unit of CIA that opened the 201 in 1960 was this CI/SIG. Blakey liked to say that Oswald was a mystery wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a riddle. Well, I can tell you, if the CIA is a riddle, then the counterintelligence staff is an enigma inside that, and the CI/SIG is a mystery inside the counterintelligence staff. Think also that the job of Angleton and counterintelligence, CI, was in effect to spy on the rest of the CIA, look for a mole, see if anyone is playing with the KGB. And that Angleton played this so closely to his chest that he worked with his own cipher. He did not use the CIA regular channels. He had his own back channel. He had his own CI people spattered all through the agency and down in Mexico City. Reportedly that David Phillips had a CI function down there. And this may explain why certain things got known in Langley even though they were never transmitted through regular CIA channels, because the CIA had their own back channel with their own code. Think also, I was talking that apart from the CI/SIG, that you have SR/CI, the counterintelligence unit over in Soviet Russia division, Tenant Pete Bagley, who's been described as the most loyal of the Angletonian fundamentalists who believed in the KGB mole. He too was following the Oswald case. And I have to tell you, I didn't know there was a CI/SIG link to this story at all until I read the Lopez report. And I'm having to condense what I think is very important material here. If any of you are interested, you can get my study, the Lopez report and the CIA's Oswald counterintelligence secrets, from the Prevailing Winds table next door. They've run off some copies for you who are researchers, and both the Lopez report and my study of it are being published shortly. It will be available from the Last Hurrah bookshop. They may already be available from the Last Hurrah bookshop. Well, briefly, I agree with John. It's very important to look at these various phases and sea changes in the history of the Lee Harvey Oswald file subject. But it's also important to realize that there's a continuity there. There never was a time when people weren't, and a great many people weren't fascinated by the latest piece of information. And this comes to another thing when I say we have to contextualize. I myself, I think up to now, used to think of how did the FBI handle Oswald? And then on a different day, I would think, how did the CIA handle Oswald? Well, we now have enough declassified documents to see that what was going on was a kind of tennis game between agencies, and probably between more agencies than just FBI and CIA. The fact that we got the FBI documents first and the CIA documents second, and we're still waiting for ONI and other third agencies. It may well be that although I'm focusing on CIA and CI here, that they're not the originators of this drama. They're just a place where all this stuff is piling up, being planted there from yet other parts of the American government. But, you know, those of you who know the FBI reports on Oswald probably agree with me how dull they seem and how incompetent, particularly the New Orleans office is, because different parts of the New Orleans FBI are generating different reports about Oswald or the Fair Play for Cuba Committee that seem to be totally unaware of each other. So it's very frustrating to read those reports to see what possible use they could be. But now we understand those reports came over into the CIA and kept the pot boiling, so to speak. Every one of these FBI reports had an audience of somewhere between 10 and 14 different sections of the CIA. Is Mr. Zaid still going to say the man's a loner when his file is getting that kind of treatment? And by the way, I'm not mocking Mr. Zaid. This is a serious question. His was a very serious report to us, and I learned a great deal from it, and I admire the methodology that he used, and we need to debunk as well as to open up. But the fact remains that we're hearing so much now from Posner, and I have to say Frontline, about how Lee Harvey Oswald was a lonely nut. Not just alone, but a lonely nut, so we can understand his psychology in terms of his isolation. The Lee Harvey Oswald files had no such psychological problem. They were well socialized and being read by very important people indeed. I think this links into the whole structure of the assassination. As I lay it out in my book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, written, of course, long before any of this stuff was released, my first chapter on the assassination is on the cover-up, the first two chapters. And I do mention James Angleton and counterintelligence. And I lay out a hypothesis which is roughly like this, and I say I think it's very well borne out by these declassified documents, that the files filled up with in October '63, it may have been earlier, but certainly a flurry of activity 5 weeks before the assassination. Cables, falsified cables, there's always something slightly wrong in them about Oswald, linking him to the KGB, other information linking him to the Cubans and DGI, the Cuban Intelligence Agency. What I call Phase 1 stories about Oswald as part of an international conspiracy. Remember that he was originally indicted as part of a of an international communist conspiracy, and that was one of the valuable parts of the Frontline show. Then creating a nuclear crisis, a real, not a make-believe danger of nuclear war, because there are rumors linking Oswald to the KGB, not out in the street, not among Berkeley academics or anything like that, but at the very highest level of the US government, and documented apparently by information, falsified but plausible, of these contacts. So what happens? You move very rapidly to a Phase 2 story about Oswald, which was he was a lone assassin. It's not any more credible than the Phase 1 story, but it does have the advantage that it's not going to lead you into a war that might very easily go nuclear, and in any case would be an unnecessary war against a country that was not in fact involved, but appeared to be involved. That is my idea of the basic dynamic of what happened to us in November '63. And to me it means that whoever actually killed the president, although an important part of the story, is no more important than this other orchestration of a Phase 1, Phase 2 scenario. And I have very little time here, and a great many things I'm not going to be able to get into, but I have to give you what I think is at the heart of that scenario, is the Phase 1 people were James Angleton and Ray Rocca and Tenant Bagley, who wrote a memo about the Kostakov contact right after the assassination and asked for a lot of information, plus some people down in the CIA station in Mexico City and Ambassador Mann, who were plugging very hard for the wildest kind of stories about Oswald, versus the Phase 2 people are in the FBI. Hoover, William Sullivan. This is what happens to Nosenko when he eventually comes to this country and says Oswald was a nut, we had nothing to do, and he acted alone. He was believed by William Sullivan, or he was supported. I keep saying believed, and I have to train myself not to use that word. He was supported by Sullivan in the FBI counterintelligence section. He was, of course, opposed and subjected to terrible treatment by Angleton's people, including Pete Bagley, over in the CI and SR/CI part of the CIA. The same people who had handled the Oswald file before handled the Nosenko matter after. And another important thing that I talk about in my book is obviously it was the Oswald file mishandled in the CIA, mishandled in the FBI, so badly mishandled in the FBI that Hoover authorized the reprimand of, I think, 17 different FBI agents, some of them very senior, including William Sullivan. And yet, very shortly after the assassination, who is put in charge of investigating this matter? The Angletonians and counterintelligence over in the CIA, and the counterintelligence staff under William Sullivan in the FBI. The same people who had mishandled it end up running the investigation, which suggests to me that the mishandling had some kind of operational thrust to it. And if I could have one more sentence. I find it very interesting that although many, many friendships inside government were broken over the assassination story, eventually Hoover stopped speaking to Angleton because Angleton remained a Phase 1 opponent of Nosenko, and Hoover was a Phase 2 lone assassin theorist who believed in Nosenko. But through all of this, one friendship remained strong, and it's a startling one. It's Angleton, the Phase 1 advocate in CIA, remained very close to William Sullivan, one of the leading Phase 2 advocates inside the FBI. It's eventually why I think Hoover fired Sullivan. He was so close to the enemy, Angleton, and even in retirement, Sullivan remained close to Angleton. And that, I think, is a fulcrum from which point we can see more clearly how this whole case was structured and imposed on the American people. Thank you very much.
Peter Dale Scott. Thank you. We're going to get into the Q&A now, but I want to mention one thing before we do that. We're given such a rare opportunity here today with Colonel Nechepurenko here that I hope those of you who have questions to ask will keep that in mind. This is a rare opportunity to maybe ask some questions from an insider in the KGB so we can get an insight into what they knew and how they can enlighten us. I think what we also will do before we get into the Q&A from the audience, we'll spend a few minutes. I think some of our distinguished panelists may have some thoughts or some questions, especially for Mr. Nechepurenko. Bill? We'll be with the Q&A in just a minute.
I think we'd probably all like to ask Colonel Nechepurenko what he knew about Oswald in the Soviet Union, and as I understand it, the KGB felt that he was unstable, that he was not a suitable candidate for them to even touch, but they did have some suspicions about where he was coming from, whether he had an intelligence connection when he came to the Soviet Union. Colonel, do you know anything about that?
Впечатление о том, что он личность не устойчивое сразу в КГБ сложилось после его попытки самоубийства.
Yeah, the impression that he's unstable was immediately after he tried to commit a suicide.
Профессор Боткинской больницы, где он
The
находился
professor,
на
medical
лечении,
professor from the Botkin Hospital, where he was,
невропатолог и
neurologist,
психиатр,
psychiatrist,
он, значит, контактом или сделал заключение
he
после.
made a medical evaluation of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Он сказал, что это человек с сильной волей,
He said this man is a strong-willed man,
и что при определенной ситуации, в определенных условиях, он может повторить свою попытку самоубийства.
that's why under certain conditions he can try to commit suicide again.
Это повлияло на отношение к нему со стороны КГБ.
And this, of course, influenced KGB. And the decision of KGB was just taken under this impression.
То есть появилось такое, что двойное давление на КГБ.
So I would like to say that there was a double pressure on KGB.
Сначала, как я уже сказал, это вышло на политический
First of
уровень.
all, the problem became political,
И вот эта опасность создать инцидента
and the
какого-то,
danger to create a dangerous situation,
связанного с личностью,
which Lee Harvey Oswald as personality could create,
наложила отпечаток, и, как я считаю, по изучению материалов,
affected the decision as far as I know, studying all the materials.
это в определенной степени определило мягкое отношение к Освальду.
It defined, so to say, soft attitude to Lee Harvey Oswald
В течение всего его пребывания в Советском
during
Союзе.
all his visit in the Soviet Union.
John, did you have a question for Oleg regarding the Jewish underground?
Yes, well, was there any, was the Jewish underground active in Minsk?
Я лично не знаю, но в то время это был как раз перерыв, когда сталинская эпоха кончилась.
Personally, I'm not sure, but I would like to tell that politically it was the period, historical period of time when the totalitarian regime of Stalin was over,
И антисемитизм, который развивался при жизни, вот в последние годы сталинские,
and last years of Stalin, anti-Semitism was very strongly developed.
against doctors,
Against
против врачей, вот
against
это,
doctors,
артистов,
and
художников,
against intelligentsia, artists, writers.
то это был период определенного смягчения. Это была хрущевская эпоха.
Now the Khrushchev period came, and it was softer.
А еще новая волна диссидентства, и в том числе антисемитизма, которая началась где-то активнее в 70-е годы,
So the new wave of anti-Semitism, which came in 70s, was
не
not yet there.
наступила еще.
So it was an interval between two waves of
Поэтому
anti-Semitism.
говорить о каком-то подполье в то время еврейском нельзя.
So I don't think we can now say something about the existence of Jewish underground at this historical period of time.
Okay, one more real quick question. If Oswald had received packages from outside of the Soviet Union, would not the KGB have known and been able to intercept and inspect those packages in all cases?
Содержание всего. Да, в Минске Освальд получал литературу, журналы и письма от своих родственников из Соединенных Штатов. Да, конечно.
Of course, you know, when Lee Harvey Oswald was in Minsk, he received certain parcels and packages from his relatives in America, and of course KGB knew what was inside.
Большинство литературы, которую он получал из Соединенных Штатов, это было эти самые приключенческое, детективное.
It's a very
Mostly
interesting
books,
response.
yeah, mostly book. He received books from the America, and mostly they were adventure books and detective stories.
Thank you very much.
Just a word to the people waiting to ask questions. What we decided to do is let the panel, each member of the panel, ask 1 or 2 questions of the Colonel, and then we'll go right to the questions. It'll just take a couple more minutes, I think. Peter, do you have a question?
In this country, there's been speculation for some time of intelligence manipulations to prevent détente, and that for example, that the downing of the U-2 by the Soviet Union was not just an accident in sense of time or a coincidence, but a planned event involving some conniving on both sides of the Iron Curtain to frustrate the possibility of a summit meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in 1960. And in addition, it has been speculated that Lee Harvey, the pilot of the U-2, Francis Gary Powers, speculated that possibly Oswald arriving from a U-2 base and promising to deliver information that he knew about might have contributed to his plane being downed. I don't want to ask so much the narrow question about the Oswald in the U-2, but in a larger sense, has there been in your country also speculation that intelligence, hardline intelligence units in both the United States and the Soviet Union conspired together to frustrate détente, and that this might have led not only to the death of Kennedy, who had reached out in this direction, but possibly even the overthrow of Khrushchev 1 year later?
Before assassination.
Well, any time. I mean, you can comment on whatever.
Not any time. It's very important.
Okay.
Я в книге попытался начало все посвятить описанию обстановки оперативной.
So in my book, at the beginning of the book, there is an introduction where I describe the whole political situation which existed in this time.
И место разведки и взаимоотношения с политиками в обоих странах.
Yes, and I describe the relationship of the intelligence
С политиками.
and the relationship of the intelligence with the politicians.
Я считаю, что в тот момент разведки обеих сторон наоборот не старались мешать.
My opinion is that at this period of time, both intelligence services tried not to interfere.
Наоборот, во всяком случае,
Vice
наша
versa,
разведка.
I'm talking about Soviet intelligence.
Они зависели от политиков, и даже некоторые операции притормаживали, чтобы не повлиять, не разрушить детант.
So they depended on politicians, and they would sometimes try to stop certain actions on politicians' side, not to prevent detente.
Что касается У-2,
As far as U-2 is concerned,
то в тот момент, когда Освальд появился в Москве,
at this period of time when Oswald came to Moscow,
наша разведка не знала о том, что Ацуги, база Ацуги, используется для подготовки полетов У-2. Не знала.
Our intelligence didn't know that the base at Suga was used by American for rocket launches.
Возможно, если бы эта информация была у нашей разведки, то отношение к Освальду было бы другим.
If our intelligence knew about that, maybe our attitude to Lee Harvey Oswald was different.
Потому что он не рассматривался как источник ценной информации.
He was not considered as the important source of intelligence.
И сам Освальд только использовал для шантажа, как я считаю, американское посольство, говоря о том, что он советом отдает ценную информацию.
And I personally think that Lee Harvey Oswald tried to blackmail the American embassy, trying to say that he's going to deliver in Moscow, he's going to deliver the Soviet Union some important military information.
Поскольку никому из советских представителей, в том числе и 2 сотрудникам разведки, которые с ним беседовали в Москве, не от имени разведки, а под прикрытием, он ничего не сообщил о Бу-2.
Oh, because when he never said anything to anybody in Moscow exactly about you two, including 2 people who debriefed him from the intelligence undercover.
Он никогда не сообщил никакой
He
информации,
didn't give any
касающейся отцу
information about this base.
Thank you. Just one more question from the panel, then we'll go to the floor. Mark, did you have a question for the Colonel?
It's certainly a known fact that within the Central Intelligence Agency with Angleton, that he was obsessed with the possibility of Soviet false defectors or moles that have infiltrated the Central Intelligence Agency. Without disclosing specific identities of individuals, Colonel, do you have personal knowledge of, or can you confirm that the Soviet Union did send false defectors to the United States, or whether they did successfully penetrate the Central Intelligence Agency?
Проблема подстав, forgery defectors. Yeah?
You mean forgery defectors, right? Bona defectors, right?
As
Yeah.
Nosenko was alleged by
Yeah,
Angleton to be
Да.
fake defector, or Soviet penetration as in a mole capacity.
Почему Носенко был bona fide defector, я постарался объяснить в главе, посвященной Носенко.
Why Nosenko is considered to be bona fide, I tried to explain in one of the chapters which is devoted to Nosenko in my book.
In details.
I don't necessarily, Nosenko, beyond Nosenko.
Yeah. Что касается системы подстав, то она использовалась обеими сторонами в течение всей холодной войны.
I would like to say that during the Cold War, both intelligence services used it for many years, the system of false defectors.
Successfully.
Удачно?
Но это в разных случаях по-разному.
Differently.
Okay, with that, I think we'll go to the floor now. And as you can see, we're running a little late, so if you can all try to figure out a way to hone your questions down to a quick answer and a quick question, and so everybody can get in, we can go to the first question.
Okay, this is addressed to Mr. Turner, and I've always been intrigued by William Harvey's role in all this. William Harvey, head of executive action, sent commando teams during the Cuban Missile Crisis, real close with mafia leaders. What's your gut feeling on his role today? And of course, I think he was moved to Italy
Who's the question?
to be away from the Kennedys after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I know it'll be talked about more tomorrow, organized crime in Cuba, but what's your gut feeling while we have you up here?
Well, Bill Harvey definitely was a key player in all of the CIA operations, starting with the Berlin Tunnel and then being involved when the anti-Castro activities heated up and the CIA began the largest station in the world on U.S. soil in contravention of the Neutrality Act and other federal laws. But in any case, Harvey was a key player. He also was one of the real radicals within this group in the CIA that was on the campaign to get Castro by any means. If you recall, during the missile crisis, Harvey launched a bootleg operation, or he was about to before he was intercepted by the agency, aimed at a penetration, paramilitary penetration into Cuba to destroy some missile sites. If this had come off, we could well have had World War III right there. Harvey is very instrumental in all this. Unfortunately, he's not with us anymore because I think if ever we had an opportunity previously to get him under oath, he would have been a fountain of information about it.
Peter Dale Scott, as partially raised the same question I want to raise, but I appreciate the fact that we're moving beyond the sort of knee-jerk reaction where we accept anything that points toward conspiracy. But it seems to me that there are, at least in the presentation of Mr. Zaid, we're at the point now where we're accepting the debunking, we're accepting partial explanations for oddities and not demanding full explanations. And there were several things. The gonorrhea episode is one. There was not only the problem of him having that medical record saying contracted in the line of duty, but it also the record was the date on the record was 2 days after Oswald was supposed to have left for Taiwan or Formosa. But even more importantly is the question of Oswald's entrance into the Soviet Union through Helsinki. And you said that there were several defectors, there are several people who got visas into the Soviet Union within 2 days. We've known that since the House Committee, but the real question is there anybody who didn't go through Gregory Golub in the Helsinki embassy who got a visa quickly?
Through Helsinki?
Yes. Is there anyone who didn't go through Helsinki? In other words, the House Committee proved that the CIA knew that Gregory Golub was able to expedite visas and get people through quickly. And that suggests that if he was the only one who could do that, then someone had to know that that was possible in order to get Oswald through. So I think the real question now is not whether we had more defectors or not necessarily defectors, more people getting visas quickly, but the real question is, were there others besides those going through Helsinki?
The State Department telegram that I have dated May 26, 64, so they were looking into this during the Warren Commission days, of course. They had cabled Helsinki from Moscow to check into that. Obviously, the Commission had requested information, and it indicates one case is remembered wherein American visa application in 1963 was delayed, if not denied, by Soviet embassy in the United States. Americans subsequently flew to Stockholm, made application for tourist visa there, and flew on to Moscow within 24 hours.
For Professors Newman and Scott, either one of you, has anyone been able to identify a professional or social link between David Atlee Phillips and General Lansdale, and if not a direct one, an indirect one?
We're trying to connect them right now.
Okay, the answer to that question is no. We have not, but I do have this piece to give you. I don't know how many of you were here for my Vietnam workshop a year ago, or who have read my book, in which two prominent characters, one are Lansdale. In the first part of the book, in 1961, he's very prominent in Vietnam policy. If you haven't read my book and you've seen the film, you may recognize him in Stone's film as a planner in the assassination, based upon the identification of the back of the head by Fletcher Prouty, the picture in Dealey Plaza. And Howard Burris, who was an aide to, military aide to then Vice President Johnson. There are some new documents which have come to light which make it pretty clear there was a very friendly connection between Lansdale and Burris, and that in fact during this crucial phase of Johnson going out in early '61 and raising the issue of American combat troops at Diem, that in fact it was Ed Lansdale who was passing a lot of the briefing information to Johnson through Burris. Very interesting stuff.
I do want to add that according to Gautam Fonzi's book, that Phillips was very close to Joseph Golden, a reporter, who was the reporter chosen by Wade and Alexander to publicize their version of the assassination, the Phase 1 version, that it was an international communist conspiracy, and more importantly, the information which Wade brought to the Warren Commission that Oswald was an FBI agent, which very much affected the way in which conduct. Knows this, but Burris turns up in George de Morenschildt's address book 4 times, one time with the very suggestive simply Burris/Haiti. And inasmuch as de Morenschild had made a trip, which he lied about, to Washington to meet with Army intelligence and the CIA on the subject of Haiti, these are all leads. They prove nothing yet, but they're certainly leads to be explored.
Two intelligence community connections to Oswald haven't been very much discussed in this panel. One would be through mind control programs like MK Ultra. I remember in particular a Rolling Stone article some years ago that hinted at that possibility. Another is through Richard K. Nagel. I'm wondering, perhaps John Newman is the person to ask this, if in the new information that you've looked at, if there's any references to the mind control program, any routing to that, or if you think those files might be a whole nother set that's not even on the verge of being produced.
Nothing in the files, in the 201 files, is there on Ultra. And in fact, well, there is some discussion now as to what is an assassination file and what is not. And I would imagine that from the agency standpoint, or any agency standpoint, there will be an attempt to define those terms in a way to restrict, to keep down the amount of documentation. We clearly have this case with the FBI, by the way, which has insisted on defining or culling out all organized crime files as not associated with the assassination, even though the House Select Committee asked for those files and did probe that aspect of the case. And there was quite a bit of discussion in the testimony and hearings on Wednesday about that. So the fact that we don't see it in the files that are over there now don't mean that they exist or they don't exist, but I haven't seen any.
In going through only some of the CIA files, while John's gone through a lot more, and I've gone through a great deal of the State Department files, Dick Russell is working on this topic, and keeping that in mind, I was trying to keep an eye out for documents he might be interested in. And although I don't think it means anything as far as government involvement, it was interesting that I came across 2 letters from private citizens that I believe were sent to Hoover within days after the assassination, remarking, and they were totally separate people, remarking how it was curious the accounts they have read of the assassination strongly resemble the movie or the book, Manchurian Candidate, which I guess is the basis. I've never read it, but the basis for all this mind control. So that notion was realized by several people just coincidentally. Richard Case Nagel is somebody I've also been looking into, trying to help out Dick, and I've got quite a few FOIAs pending with agencies. All the documents I've seen so far, I think all that have been publicly available for a while, except for one of them that I've seen, aren't in favor of him. They're very negative. There are a lot more that we haven't seen yet, but the ones that have been released have been negative. And one court case that Dick did not have in his book that I gave to him afterwards when he was trying to get his benefits was about 100 pages long of decision, which really went through his medical background. It put him in a bad light. That's not to mean that Dick's conclusions aren't wrong, but there's nothing that's bolstered him yet in the files.
For Mr. Turner, in light of your experience in intelligence and counterintelligence methodologies, could you explain to the group what an intelligence trust is, and is it possible that Fidel Castro could represent an American intelligence trust?
I didn't, intelligence what?
An intelligence trust.
Trust. Intelligence trust. And is it possible that Fidel Castro?
Explain to the group what an intelligence trust is, and is it possible that Fidel Castro could represent an American intelligence trust?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to in an intelligence trust. That wasn't part of the vocabulary that I'm versed in, but maybe if you'll explain that, I can answer you if I identify what it is.
Maybe our ex-KGB counterpart could explain what an intelligence trust is.
Are you referring, it was called the Trust, right? It was a Soviet operation in the 20s and 30s that.
And in the 50s,
Intelligent trust.
In 1520.
50s, the
In
Polish
20s,
Intelligence
in
Trust.
20s.
Yes.
And then also in the 50s, the Polish Intelligence Trust.
Ну, это операция, трест.
Oh, excuse me, you mean Russian operation?
Well, it's called
Yeah,
the
as
Polish
you
Intelligence.
mispronounce the word, it's trest. Trest.
Ну,
In English, it's spelled
Are you
T-R-U-S-T.
trying to, oh, okay. So, you want to say something?
Ну,
Трест,
я начало тогда не слышал, о чем он
So,
говорит.
but
Он обращался к Тору.
can you say, because it's it's very difficult to hear from here, I don't know why. Can you come closer and repeat your question? Very shortly.
Right. Would you explain what the concept of an intelligence trust is? And is it possible that Fidel Castro could represent an American intelligence trust?
Yeah, let's just do this relatively quickly. We don't understand where you're going, and if you can help us, then we have to move on.
Well, an intelligence trust is where one operative intelligence group puts forward in another group's camp a presumable person to draw others to him of similar attitudes, and so that they're drawn out like sugar and bees, and then at one time then they're swooped up and caught up after they're attracted to him. In the 50s, there was the Polish Intelligence Trust, which caused a great deal of difficulty for the Americans to adjust to dealing with this type of Soviet methodology and intelligence.
Yeah, the dangle.
Well,
Yeah,
that's-
well, yeah, what I feel you're referring to is that somebody is exfiltrated into the other country with a certain posture, and others are attracted to him because of that posture, not who he really is. Is that what you're asking?
It's that type of appearance, except
Yeah.
it doesn't always require exfiltration. Sometimes it's a native.
Yeah. Well, you know, like I said earlier, in this wilderness of mirrors, it is intelligence, anything's possible. And I wouldn't even say that's illogical that that happened. I just don't know that it did.
That's good, Doc.
I can appreciate your observance of the events today, Mr. Scott, as convergent. By that same token, the events in Dealey Plaza of November 22nd could be seen as confluent. I would like to ask if you could pose any light on two gentlemen, and both intelligence men, who may shed a little more light on what happened, and they would be David L.T. Phillips, a.k.a. Maurice Bishop, and Charles Willoughby.
Well, I think in the light of the documents, we will be even more interested in David Atlee Phillips, although we have been interested in him before. We do learn the way he signed his initials turns up against his name in one of these documents, and in the last weeks it's seen quite often. I had to go through those 3,000 pages extremely quickly. I only had about 3 days with 1,000 documents a day. But I have the possibility that he may have been flying around and been not only in Mexico City, but also up in the JM Wave station in Miami, which had its own operatives certainly down in Mexico City. As for General Willoughby, I've been interested in him for many years, and Dick Russell cites my unpublished Dallas Conspiracy about him. What is particularly interesting about him remains for me the fact that he was part of a private intelligence network that had scooped up a number of ex-Nazi types, and including Colonel Cannon, who certainly, I'm not a great believer that Richard Case Nagel is very important to this story, but the man who handled him in Japan, Jack Cannon, is part of this network. And I think some of the extremists inside the Pentagon, who are propagandists for the Pentagon, Billy James Hargis, etc., there was a milieu there extremely right-wing, not very well not many links to what you might call the establishment center of this country, but financed by the Hunt family, and therefore in no shortage for funds at that time. And I cannot point them in the direction of the assassination at this point, but people have been looking at them and should continue to do so.
Lee Harvey Oswald used several names. He used Alec James Heidel. He used Lieutenant J. Evans. He used a Sergeant Robert Fidel. These names, when assigned numerical values to letters according to the position in the alphabet, start matching names of people that he knew or the aliases of the people that he knew. I didn't know if this is coincidental or what, so I run a program and run 300 in a computer, and it'd be less than 1 out of 100 chances that this would happen. My question to Mr. Newman is, when an agent sees a phony name, how does he know that that name means something?
Well, I can't answer that question. I can tell you in these files we found a number of false names, cover names that were used, and we queried the DDO people that we interviewed, which were almost 40, about this. And it seems that the practice of using a false name or a cover name was pretty much universal, but not always. Quite often you find documents signed with people's real names. But there are a number of ones. What's the one you asked me about, Peter, the other day? Chief of Station in Mexico City. Yeah, no, you asked me another name. Yeah, Curtis, that's right. Curtis was the false name, the cover name for Win Scott, who was Chief of Station in Mexico City. But it seems that, to me, that would have been the normal practice. But by the time of this period that we're talking about, early 60s, the practice was violated repeatedly, and people often signed off and communicated using their real names. But beyond that, I couldn't enlighten you anymore as to specific meanings behind a particular cover name.
Thank you. Also, just as a point of information, the J. Evans you referred to, hasn't that been worked on before? That's Julian Evans. I think Oswald used that on an employment application. That was one of his landlords, I believe.
Yes, the E.J. Evans matches Jacob Rubenstein in a numerical sense.
Hi, I'd like to ask Mr. Necheparenko a question. Let me just preface it quickly that people should realize there's always going to be competing agendas within intelligence organizations, within governments in general, within agencies and between agencies. With that in mind, I'd like to ask Mr. Necheparenko if he's aware of any rival faction, any other faction within Soviet intelligence, be it KGB or Soviet military intelligence, that issued or had any reports that put Oswald in a totally different light than just being a loner, possibly being a bona fide American intelligence agent under the cover of a confused defector.
But do you mean bribery? You mentioned the word bribery? You mentioned the word bribery?
No, what I'm trying to find out is within every government, there's always going to be competing enclaves. We saw that with the fall of Khrushchev in '64, with the attempt to remove Gorbachev in 1990, and the Kennedy assassination, the most visible. What I'd like to know, are you aware of any other factions within the KGB or Soviet intelligence that had issued reports that would have put Lee Harvey Oswald in a totally different light than what you're familiar with, say, as a American agent?
За все время пребывания Освальда в Советском Союзе
During the whole visit of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union,
документов каких-то подтверждающих его принадлежность американской разведки не было.
There are no documents confirming that he belonged to the American any intelligence we don't have.
Хотя его изучали как американского агента.
Though he was put under surveillance and bargaining and all other things as a suspect of being an American agent.
И когда он уехал в Соединенные Штаты, вернулся,
And when he left and came back to America,
а его дело направили в архив,
and his file was sent to archives,
то на нем было написано, что значит, каких-либо данных, подтверждающих его принадлежность к американской разведке, в процессе работы по нему добыто не было.
So there was a conclusion of KGB that there is no evidence proving that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA agent.
А когда после убийства президента Кеннеди его дело сдавалось в архив окончательно,
And when after the assassination his files were given to the archives again,
то тогда начальник контрразведки, это Second Chief Directorate,
then the head of the second chief directorate,
он написал в резолюции, в постановлении о сдаче дела в архив, что поскольку материалы дела имеют исторический характер, то нужно их хранить, значит, как бы...
So the file was given another title. It was said because now the file had a historical meaning, the file should be preserved and saved forever.
Then I could assume then that there was no bumping into of Soviet military intelligence also monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald when he was in the Soviet Union?
So you mean there are no files in GRU or what?
Yes.
Yeah, you mean there are no files
Other than the KGB.
like GRU or something else like that, right? Military intelligence,
Right.
Minister of Internal Affairs, right?
Дело на Освальда было только в контрразведке.
No, all files and all information about Lee Harvey Oswald was only introduced by KGB.
Only one file in KGB Counterintelligence Directorate.
My question is about the real Otto Otepka. Bill, it's addressed to you and maybe to Peter. The Otto Otepka I know is a McCarthyite, a right-wing extremist. His phone was bugged by RFK. He was fired by JFK. And he essentially ran Otto Otepka's travel agency to get Oswald from country to country. And I'd like to get your opinion, Bill, of what you think the real Otto Otepka actually was.
Well, I agree with your characterization of Otepka. He was an extreme right-winger and tied in with Francis Knight, the ogre of the State Department and the Passport Division. And they were motivated strictly by ideology, very much so. So any actions that were taken, a lot of people were legitimately entitled to passports, never got them because of this ideological bias. So yeah, they could well have figured in Lee Harvey Oswald's travels, and I don't think you'd get it out of Otepka.
Can I add, I wrote about Otepka in the Dallas Conspiracy in 1970. And I didn't like him very much on the basis of his record in history. Apparently from the McCarthy period, when Scott McCloud was imposed on the State Department as a way of helping Hoover to spy on the State Department through the Office of Security. But when I met him, I have to say my reaction, I interviewed him in '78. My reaction to him was somewhat like Mark Zay's, that although our politics were totally opposed, here was a man who had his facts, and paradoxically on the issue of Oswald, we had a lot to agree about. And my memory of what he was telling me is that he was much more engaged in the wrongness of the way the State Department had handled Oswald than you got from Mark Zaid's account. Particularly that Mark didn't get down to 1963, and I'd love to hear him comment on this. But I remember vividly, and it was on camera, so you know this could be checked. that Otepka said it was absolutely ridiculous to say that as the Warren Commission did, that the handling of the passport in 63 was routine. He got it in one day. He shouldn't have got it at all, and the reason that he didn't was because the FBI should have had him on the security index, but they didn't. And this is exactly the thing that the FBI agrees about and Sullivan got reprimanded for. So in other words, to boil it all down, Otepka had a point, and he was genuinely, I'm sure of it, genuinely very paranoid about how it could be that Oswald was being somehow run through the State Department, and with this kind of record being given this special kind of treatment.
I'll just say, when I interviewed Mr. Otepka, I strictly restricted my questions to that of the false defector study. I did not question him about the later passport issuance in 1963. The only thing I can say is, in looking through the State Department files, they changed nearly every regulation they had regarding defectors in general following 1963 because there were an infinite amount of loopholes which they felt might have prevented the assassination if they had been in place in 62, 63.
Well, there is one possible explanation of why he wasn't on the security index. The security index, by the way, was a list of deemed subversives in the United States, U.S. citizens who were, because of their activities, were to be arrested in the event of a national emergency and detained. And I know when I was in the Seattle office, I was assigned certain people, and I had because we didn't have that many agents as opposed to the numbers of people on the list, we had trusted members of the Seattle Police Department who were designated to go with us on these arrests. And I'm not sure if memory serves me accurately, but I think I would have had to pick up Jessica Mitford. In any case, in any case, there's, I think, a lot of implication that Oswald was an FBI informant. And if that was the case, he wouldn't have been on the security index. He would have been S-172 in Dallas. That's one possible explanation.
I'd like to ask Mr. Nevchenko if he could speculate, and he can only speculate, as to why the CIA would have such a great interest in a man like Oswald, who was, one, not an agent, and two, so marginal that probably no agency would want to employ him for any serious function. As an former intelligence agent, could he just speculate as to why this great interest?
Как раз КГБ не считал, что ЦРУ может его послать как агента.
KGB didn't consider that Lee Harvey Oswald can be the CIA agent.
И председатель комитета, бывший Семичастный,
And the chairman of KGB, Mr. Semichastny,
когда мы с ним беседовали,
when I interviewed him,
он вспомнил, что те, кто занимался делом Освальда в то время,
the people who were dealing with Lee Harvey Oswald at this period of time,
они обижались, говоря, что неужели CIA считает нас такими дураками, что шлет нам такого агента.
they were saying that we don't think that CIA consider us to be fools that to send somebody like Lee Harvey Oswald as an agent.
Why would our CIA be so interested in him? Does he have any idea?
Sorry?
CIA.
Why CIA would be interested?
Yeah, Mr. Newman has documented such extensive interest in Oswald by our CIA that doesn't make sense considering your own assessment of him.
Ну, во-первых, я не знал этих документов до сегодняшнего дня.
I didn't know about the existence of these documents by now.
Okay.
И, во-вторых, это дело CIA, не наше.
And I think this is a question to CIA.
I was it.
And there is no straightforward answer yet that you can prove from these files. For example, whether or not it was simply the threat of a man who knew secrets, and who threatened to give those secrets up, or whether it was something deeper. That remains to be seen, and maybe when we get the rest of all the files, we'll have a better basis upon which to make such a judgment.
And there's still the opportunity to compare CIA files to the rest of the defectors' files. We won't get that. They'll be protected for privacy reasons unless we can successfully argue to the review board that other defectors' 201 files are relevant to how the CIA treated Oswald.
Я думаю, что вот то, что я услышал сегодня от очень интересном для меня выступлении господина Ньюмана,
But something that I heard today from a very interesting report of Mr. Newman,
для меня это также интересно, думаю, как для вас всех и для
it was the
господина
same,
Ньюмана.
the same interesting to me and new as for you.
Это та новая информация, которую я раньше не видел и анализировать не мог.
This is new information. I didn't know about that, so I couldn't analyze it. If Lee Harvey Oswald was a person to be sent by CIA.
И почему я считаю сегодняшнюю встречу и вот этот симпозиум очень важным?
That's why I consider this meeting and this symposium of great importance.
Потому что еще на пресс-конференции в январе 1992 года в Москве
In 1992, in January, in Moscow, during the press conference,
я выразил и пожелание, и надежду на то,
I hoped and expressed my hope
что в каком-то будущем
that in future
необходимо собраться не только исследователям проблемы
it's
Далласа,
important to get together not only for to the researchers in Dallas
которые занимались этим в Америке, я
who
имею в
were
виду
doing a
американских,
research in America, I mean American researchers.
но и из других стран, которые имели отношение к проблеме Далласа.
And I consider it important that people from different countries will come together and consider
Я
this
имею в
case.
виду Россию и, возможно, Кубу.
I consider Russia and Cuba
И различные эксперты
and different experts
по различным
in
проблемам,
different problems,
на мой взгляд,
to my opinion,
должны вот сесть так, как мы сегодня сидим,
should come together as we are here
и устроить мозговой штурм
and to have this brainstorm session
над той информацией,
based on the information
которой мы теперь можем обменяться.
we now have the right to exchange.
Вот тогда, наверное, как я говорю в книжке,
As I said in my book,
мы можем вставить ключ в загадку Далласа и повернуть его в
then we
нужном
can put
направлении.
the key and turn it and maybe solve certain mysterious questions.
Потому что вот все эти 30 лет
Because all the 30 years,
ни одна сторона, и ни одна служба, и ни один человек не знали Ли Харви Освальда как единое целое.
so nobody, including intelligence and personality, knew Lee Harvey Oswald as he is.
В течение всех 30 лет. Потому что КГБ не знал, как жил Освальд до приезда в Советский Союз, и не знал, как он жил после отъезда.
KGB lacked information about Lee Harvey Oswald period of time before he came to Russia and after he left Russia.
ФБР, CIA, Navy Intelligence Office, SORS, no?
FBI, CIA, Navy Intelligence Office.
Они хорошо знали, как
They knew Lee Harvey Oswald and
его
the
background
period and his background
до отъезда в Советский
before he
Союз
came to Russia.
и после
and
этого
after.
приезда, но не знали, что происходило
But
в
they
Советском Союзе.
didn't know any information about him being in the Soviet Union.
Хотя сегодня я вижу из выступления господина Ньюмана, что есть признаки того, что они что-то знали,
So
зачем он в Советский Союз.
today I feel, judging on Mr. Newman report, that they knew something about this period of time.
Это новая информация для меня,
It's new information for me,
которая дает возможность по-новому взглянуть на...
and it helps me to look at different things differently.
Так же, как господину Ньюману, наверное, моя информация дает возможность сопоставить и посмотреть новым взглядом.
And I think it's mutual.
Thank you. I think we have to move along. If the panel doesn't mind, can you stay another 5 or 10 minutes to finish up these
Colonel
questions?
Nesterenko, please.
Can we
I
all
forgot
stay a
my
little bit
question
longer?
after, but I think I'm going to try to remember it though. I'd like to speculate that Soviet Union knew the assassination of JFK was going down. you know, before, let's say, Oswald tipped you off in Mexico City, you know, to Colonel Kosciuszko and to yourself too, wasn't it, sir? It seems like it was kind of cruel to turn Oswald back to his death, his certain death, because this is what he was pleading with you to get him out of the country, you know, because he knew by this time that he was the, you know, dead patsy. Would you care to comment on the fact that you couldn't help him in some way to get him clear of the certain fate that he was going to have? And but the main thing, would you care to comment upon the fact that Russia didn't care, Soviet Union didn't care about the JFK assassination? The President of the United States going down wasn't going to affect the geopolitical setup for the Soviet Union too much in any one way, whether he lived or whether he died. And it was in the province sphere, geopolitically, of the Anglo-American policy. And since they were pulling this,
we have the question.
So what is
since
the
they were
question?
pulling this thing off,
What
since
is
they
the
were
question?
Okay, thanks.
You understand the question?
Question was there advanced knowledge? The question, very simply, was there advanced knowledge in the Soviet Union before that Kennedy would be assassinated?
Knowledge? Was there any knowledge that?
Yes. None. Absolutely.
None.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mr. Nesterenko, you indicated earlier that Russia did send false defectors here. Are you aware of American false defectors to Russia during, at any time in our history?
Это происходило не обязательно таким образом, что мы посылали сюда, а CIA посылала к нам. Это происходило в третьих странах часто.
You know, in fact, I can tell you that defectors were sent in a different system and scheme. Like, it doesn't mean we send defectors to America and the Americans send defectors to Russia. We send sometimes defectors to the third countries.
И это немножко есть разница между вот в оперативной терминологии. Что в оперативной терминологии есть разница между defectors и подставой. Ну вот подстава я сейчас не помню.
So maybe there is some type of terminology. I would like to say that there is a difference we use in our vocabulary in KGB. I'm not sure if I can put the same terminology here. It's like maybe close. Somebody is like a mole and a defector.
Defector – это тот, кто переходит на другую сторону.
Defector is a person who is going to another side.
И контакт с ним очень сложен.
And to contact him is very difficult, to be in touch with him.
Он уже в руках другой стороны.
Because now he is in the hands of the other side.
Вот defector in the place, or at the place.
I think you misunderstand. What I'm asking is whether, you know, consciously, there were people, as I understood you said earlier, that seemed to defect but had no real interest in defecting, that were sent here from Russia who had wanted and fully intended at some time to return. Are you aware of American defectors that went to Russia that the CIA or that the KGB figured out were false defectors that had no interest in staying in Russia but were there for God knows what reason with an intention ultimately of returning to the United States?
К нам туда? Ну, трудно сказать. У нас были несколько, я знаю несколько случаев, когда у нас оставались американские граждане, а спустя некоторое время уезжали назад, кроме Освальда.
Но они были сирийцы или нет?
Нет.
So there were certain defectors, as to my knowledge, who came to from America to the Soviet Union, stayed there, and then they went back because it had no desire to stay there. But I don't know exactly if they were sent by CIA or not. I don't have this type of knowledge.
Did the KGB consider any of them to be American agents?
В документе.
You mean in general, or you mean a certain period of time?
В документе Министерства иностранных дел и КГБ в Центральный комитет.
Well, I'm sorry, I just want to tell you something. Of course, any person, I'm not translating, of course, any person in the historical period of time when Lee Harvey Oswald was sent, any person who was defected from the West, and even from socialist country, was observed and considered to be as a possibility of being a spy. of an agent. And everybody was watched because not so many people really came there. And there were not so many defectors. Even people who were defectors and were sent like undercover of the Communist Party or under some democratic, they were even watched because still it's a part of a job of KGB not to trust.
Next question, can we move along here? We're over time, so if we can make everything really quick so we can get the last three questions in.
Just
Don't
kind of
forget
an overall
he's on the
question related to the same field, whether he feels that the American intelligence agencies sort of copied the Soviet KGB methodology of using false defectors and trying to create moles.
The American intelligence agencies copied the Soviet model.
Ты думаешь о том, что американская разведка копировала советские модели?
Обмен опытом происходит.
Well, the exchange of experience is common in any profession.
Very quickly, I have a question for Mark Zaid. Mark, I know you're a lawyer.
Каждая операция противника внимательно анализируется.
Of course, everything is analyzed, what is being done by other intelligence and methods, and everything is being copied.
И ее отдельные элементы
Not the whole pattern, but certain elements of it are being,
в другом сочетании
and they are combined with something different and being used by the enemy.
by other side.
My question is addressed to Mark Zaid. Mark, I know you're a lawyer, but like that other well-known lawyer, I do not think you have the case closed against Oswald as an agent of the U.S. government. Your reference to Oswald and the protection item, where he was under the protection, that statement, and your reference to the State Department file on that, I think is misplaced. I think what you're looking for is a needle in the wrong haystack. When Oswald also said on that tape that he was not under the protection of the U.S. government. That's one point. And the second point is that when it was published in the volumes, it was omitted in the volumes. And who did the omitting? A front for the CIA, Inca, of which Ed Butler, who I assume is going to be here, has very many questions to raise about why this was deleted. I think you avoided the whole question by ignoring certain evidence.
Well, as a good lawyer, I phrased my statements very carefully to indicate that there is no available public evidence, not to, as the Warren Commission did, not to exclude the possibility that there might be evidence someday discovered. The statement that I came across in the State Department telegram is essentially just speculation on my part for what that might have been for why Oswald made that comment. I was struck by the fact that the language was exactly the same, worded in the State Department telegram as how Oswald originally worded it. And my thoughts just raced to the possibility that that was the discussion Oswald had had with the embassy officials to determine whether or not he was to be safe from the Russians and why the U.S. should help him get back to the United States. In judging that discussion that he had in the debate, the only thing I would offer as a possibility was that he was very taken aback by being surprised with the information Butler and Bringuier had on him as far as his defection. And perhaps he may have been a little unwilling or did not wish to indicate that, in fact, the Russians, through the Red Cross there, had actually paid his salaries and given him additional money. I mean, I have absolutely no idea. I certainly wouldn't try and put myself in Lee Harvey Oswald's mind. But as a lawyer, I go by the evidence, and I don't think the evidence indicates, as much as I would love to find evidence of a false defector or an intelligence relationship while in the Soviet Union.
I'm tempted to say that's all the time we have and see what this lady's reaction would be, but one more question.
All right. There's a photograph of Oswald purportedly taken in Minsk in the company with a man referred to as Alfred from Hungary. Elsewhere, he's referred to as Alfredo from Cuba, and he has intrigued some of us researchers, the identity of this individual. Do the Russians know anything about this person?
Yeah.
There's a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald with an individual known as Alfredo from Cuba. Yeah.
I think the picture, I believe, is in your book of Oswald and his friend.
I have a recollection that somewhere that man's been identified,
Alfredo,
right?
the name is Alfredo. Is he Hungarian or Cuban?
Well, I've seen him referred to both ways.
Because there was a person whose name is Alfredo who was Hungarian, and Lee Harvey Oswald knew him from Minsk.
Well, my question is what do you Russians know about this individual, aside from his being Alfredo from Cuba or Alfred from Hungary?
Oh, you saw this photograph in Oleg's book?
I thought I did. Maybe I might have been mistaken.
Well, it's a photograph in the Warren report.
Oh, it's in the Warren. Right. Is it?
I don't mean to hold
Further
you up.
question, did you know of any Cubans in Minsk? That will deal with it, I think.
No.
No, there were no people from Cuba whom Lee Harvey Oswald knew, and there was no report and no information that he befriended or just met anybody. He had some couple of friends, and from Hungary. That's why I asked the name, because Alfredo is the name of his friend from Hungary, who defected from Hungary. And that was the only contact, except Michigan University Orchestra, which came once, which Lee Harvey Oswald had being in Minsk with foreigners.
In KGB files, there are not information about some Cuban contacts of Oswald in Minsk.
I'd like to thank everybody for attending tonight and sticking around so long. Remember, 6:30, Posner and Wecht are going to be on Crossfire, so catch it if you can. See you next time.
Wow.